Have you ever had the chance to speak with someone who studies the past? I don't just mean in history, I mean cultures, like someone who's traveled to a lot of ancient ruins and enjoys studying the cultures. So, what would you call that? Because to me, it was always someone who um, was an anthropologist, someone who studies cultures. But recently, I've come to the conclusion that some people study geographies, that have a prevalent population of adherence to a certain religion. And in doing that, they get to sort of see um, what the ruins are of that civilization that kind of speak to what their texts refer to. So imagine going to the Colosseum, for example, in in Europe, and kind of having maybe reading or studying alongside being around the ruins and kind of getting a feel for, like, I mean, what was the culture like what was the population, and how did we evolve from this? So what I'm trying to understand how to bring a postmodern context to studying cultures without always making it about scripture, because sometimes if we focus too much, it becomes we kind of become drawn in, and then we're not necessarily relatable to other people. So I don't really know. I know there's some motivational speakers who will speak about the history or the lifetime of the prophet, for example. And in doing that, they tie in stories through the Quran that are mentioned, and then they'll go to those sites. So, for example, there's, I think in Jordan, um, there's the grave of one of the prophets, and there's a story about, I think, there's seven sleepers, where there was a king who used to almost, I think, just persecute anybody who was not trying to practice monotheism. And so they left their sort of locale, and they hid in a mountain for a little bit. And it turns out that they actually fell asleep for close to, I don't really know what it is, but it's almost like saying that they died and then they were reincarnated. And when they came back into town, they realized that they had actually slept for longer than what they anticipated, because nothing made sense. Like, the currency was different, their language was different, the culture was different. So it's almost like, imagine that. Like, I had talked about this previously for a little bit, about how when we go to sleep, we don't really know where our soul goes. And it's almost like if there's a great shift between our reality from, for example, what we remember, and then how things suddenly change. Like, how do we adapt to that, or how do we explain that to ourselves? So in the context of that story in particular, the idea is that there is a mercy um, in sleep itself. Like, some people who are unable to sleep are usually understood to be under a lot of stress, or something under their that they're under pressure, that has their mind kind of thinking like just without stopping, and that creates a type of mental health kind of dis-ease. And in that scenario, it becomes difficult to kind of engage with society, and it kind of unravels from there. So it's almost like, if you were to read kind of like a metaphysical underlining of that, if somebody was trying to hold on to a way of life and they're really struggling with adapting to the culture, sometimes it is good to just withdraw entirely and just try to adapt to the culture without really talking about what your beliefs are. So I don't know. I don't really know how this ties in with pilgrimage, because in a lot of traditions, visiting kind of sacred sites or ruins is something that is revered, and it's encouraged. And sometimes it helps us see what the significance of some celebrations are, so that it kind of gives it a little kind of robust meaning for why we practice them. So, just generally, like, I had taken a TEFL course, which is teaching English as a foreign language, several years ago. I didn't end up traveling or anything, but um, that was one of the things I would have wanted to do, was to kind of just spend a year, for example, in one country teaching the language, and then, like, aside from that, just kind of visiting um, like part of the culture. So, for example, like Spain would have been one of them. Japan, I would have liked to visit, and Turkey. So, kind of these like really ancient cities, and to just get a feel for what spirituality was like, because you don't always hear about countries that are very open about the way they talk about their way of life. And so you kind of just wonder, like, how have you evolved into that, where people kind of just accept like a spiritual way of existing without necessarily always talking about it or kind of having to defend it. So one of the things that is actually inherent in this being a practice that's encouraged is that it's meant to be a struggle. And we know that of travel. It's really, it's especially if there's harsh conditions, or so it's like in a desert or anything like that. And part of the idea is that it's um it's something that helps us appreciate the ease that we have of being in one place. So not everybody has that the luxury. Some people are nomads and they don't have um the the resources, almost like if they're in certain clans or sub communities where resources run out and then they have to like pick up and leave every so often. Just imagine what that would be like, right? So this is kind of like what it's like to have a lifestyle like in the Western society right now, or in the Western world, where zeitgeists are a thing, right? So imagine you've kind of accustomed yourself to, you know, I don't know, for like 10 years you've been studying something and you kind of feel like you've got a grasp on it, and maybe you are a professor and you're like, with every new kind of wave of students, like every 4 years or something, you feel kind of like a just kind of like a gradual shift of what's what the students are and like what society's kind of working towards and what the thoughts and ideas are. So in that regard, it would be almost like you're keeping up, as it is, as it were. But for parents who are kind of like disengaged, kind of like they don't really have that direct contact with society and with what's happening all the time, that's it's almost kind of parallel to what that nomadic culture is. So it's almost, and particularly if you are someone who is like a young parent and then your children have children early on. So you could be a grandparent who has a grandchild who's 5, right? And you'd still be like in pretty good condition. Like you're still able to come and go, and your overall health and wealth is pretty good. So in that scenario, it would be kind of relatable, where you can't necessarily assume that what you know of the world is going to be relatable, and you kind of also have to figure out a way to kind of keep up. And that might be easier in some families or some scenarios or geographies than in others. But I think that's kind of what we can kind of derive, like, as a metaphysical meaning, that struggle is inherent in life, whether you're moving around or not, or like metaphysically or metaphorically, or in an actual geography. Like if your work is one that involves you to travel a lot and you kind of constantly have to adapt to changes and new ways of understanding cultures. Um, for some people, they enjoy that. Like they're restless and they like sightseeing, and it's not so much of a challenge as it might be for others. So this kind of helps me kind of segue into a little bit of the postmodern world now, where sometimes I think just as far back as 20 years ago, a lot of the styles of the 70s were kind of coming back. And I feel like that's kind of what the cycle is. It's like we start a little bit ahead of a time, and then we go back, and then we kind of have that cyclical kind of progression. So if we end up having kind of like a limited access to original ideas, how can we rebuild that? And my argument is that we can kind of try to take advantage of travel and tourism, and almost suggest to ourselves that, like, because we know scripture is timeless, and in the sense that the ideas that those communities kind of evolved into the world are almost malleable. Like we can kind of change them as we've developed through time, but the sites are the same. So it'd be kind of cool to see what the culture is in that immediate area, and then kind of wonder, like, what can that do for like our creative process, and what we can kind of allow our mind to more deeply understand. And because popular culture loves newness, I think sometimes we can revisit the same ideas over and over again and just add little tweaks, like, because we tend to have newer challenges as we go along with time. So sometimes Like for right now, I imagine that the culture is more um, concerned with internet safety for young children because basically, if you have a child who's 14 now, their whole life is basically technology. So to me, having to teach them about Facebook, I feel like I would probably learn more from them than they would be able to kind of learn from me. So it's things like that where it's like, yeah, I don't like, especially if I haven't been keeping up with technology myself, right? So things like that that kind of bring you back into the world outside of technology. I think it's reinvigorating in a way. So kind of like if you were to ask children who haven't been to a farm or don't understand the process of planting something, um, you can ask them like, where do we get a potato, for example? I'll just say, well, we'll just go to the store and get it, right? But if you show them that, yeah, we do, but where was it before it was at the store? Like, how did it come into existence? So taking them backwards like that is kind of like a natural way of assuming that we can kind of forget about the realities of life that are kind of natural, and revisiting them is always a good idea. It's just going to kind of enrich the way you see the world. So what would you do if you had an opportunity to take a week off or 2 weeks off and just relax into a vacation? And how can you try to invite inspiration into your way of thinking? So almost planning that before going on vacation allows you kind of to free your mind, as though I want to study in a way what it is I'd want to question and kind of think about. And that way, when I'm actually like traveling or sightseeing, I can sort of pull away from technology a little bit and just focus on the actual natural world, and kind of examine like what is it about the anthropological aspect of the world right now that I'm studying that I can kind of bring back to my home context and evolve with. And I think that'd be a great opportunity for popular culture to coexist with religion as a kind of new postmodern lens. And I'll see you next time.